Hello there. Welcome to the IWS podcast. This is your host, RJ, and I have a very special guest today with me, my man, Dr. Michael Keys. Good morning, sir. How are you doing today?
Good to be on the show, man. Appreciate you inviting me.
Yes, sir, man. It's very important to bring a lot of like minded brothers like myself and others that I've been fortunate enough to interview into this platform. A lot of course, the conversations are surrounding mental health, but I always like to lean into the areas of expertise that my guests happen to specialize in, particularly with you being in medicine. So I'm certain we're going to talk a bit about that today. But I always like to begin with sharing, inviting the guests to talk a bit about their lived experiences growing up, because obviously we all have different paths that we take in our lives. But a lot of it starts with what we experience when we grow up, the environments that we're in, the family dynamics, all of that. So, what would you feel comfortable sharing about what your experience is like growing up in your home?
I was born in Japan. I was the son of a Japanese woman and an African American father. My dad was in the Navy, and so he was stationed out in Japan. He met my mom there. They got married and then had me. And we immigrated to the States when I was like maybe 5 or 6 years old, mainly because of opportunities.
Yeah,
Japan has a very homogenous race situation, and so people who are considered gaijin or outsiders are basically anyone who's not purely Japanese. And
yeah,
so, in my case, even though I'm half Japanese, I was still considered a gaijin, and so that would make it harder for me to succeed in life because I would always be considered an outsider.
sure.
And so, there's more opportunities in the States. And since I had dual citizenship at the time, we immigrated to the States and kind of moved to Gainesville, Florida, um, where I met you.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, but yeah, grew up in Gainesville just to be closer to my dad's side of the family. But because of the work situation, my dad stayed in Japan, and so my mom immigrated with me pretty much, and I grew up almost in a single parent household since my
Oh, yeah.
dad was gone so much.
Yeah, yeah. No, man, I like the way you summarize that. I think it's interesting dynamic. Sometimes when we're talking about people from single parent households, it's usually where there's an absent father or the father is working and maybe he's just like, kind of in and out. But
Hmm.
obviously you have a very different lens, it seems like, when it comes to that because of the cultural aspects
Hmm.
and even touching on the opportunities. I like to think a lot about culture and the way it shapes our reality and the way we perceive things, and I want to make sure I emphasize what you just said there. So if you had stayed there, you in Japan, you probably would have had limited opportunity maybe to be successful in your life. Is that essentially what you mean?
Yeah, just because, they're kind of a group mindset. And
Yeah.
so the pathways to success are more limited compared to the United States, where, stereotypical American dream where anyone can succeed if they follow a certain pathway.
Yeah.
Um, it's just, I think America just has a lot more opportunities. And so, in order to have access to those resources, my family decided it's best to move to the States.
Yeah. Okay. No, that definitely makes sense. I mean, access and opportunity, I think, are a wide reasons why many of our families come here in the first place, right? Compared to maybe where they came from. And with that
Exactly.
cultural aspect, being mixed race or having different parents from different backgrounds and trying to navigate a more homogenous society where you don't necessarily get treated the same, definitely
Mm-hmm.
makes sense why we would come here. And I'm actually glad we get to talk about that because I will, to be a little transparent. Um, we obviously went to school together in high school and middle school, and being able to be around other people who are her parents coming from different backgrounds, I always thought was very important because it's hard to form one's cultural identity when
Mm-hmm.
you're not all from, when your family's not all from the same place.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously hearing your story, I think it really resonates with me because I remember feeling like that to a certain degree, not the having to immigrate from another country, but the
Mm-hmm.
aspect of trying how to navigate that when you have family from different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
But sort of piggybacking on that, so you were mentioning obviously your father was more or less in Japan a lot of the time. How do you think that that played on you to a certain degree, growing up primarily with your mom?
It kind of definitely made me grow up a lot sooner than I guess others.
Yeah,
I was kind of the quote unquote man of the house, just because. I had the unique responsibility since my mom didn't speak English. Like growing up, me and my mom learned English together. And because children learn languages a lot faster because of the
Yeah.
plasticity of our brains when we're young, I picked up the English language a lot faster than my mom. And so I remember uh, as a kid having those like little textbooks that have like, dinosaurs and stuff and just basic English. I would just kind of go through it with her. And
Yeah.
so we had a bonding experience where we would kind of learn the language together. Um, and so I was always trying to learn because it was almost like trying to survive in a foreign environment, And
Yeah.
so I think that helped me from an educational standpoint, just because I was exposed to, survive, you have to survive, you have to learn to survive.
Yeah.
And so I kind of carry that with me throughout my career. And so, growing up without my dad physically around was tough, because you see other kids playing with their dads, throwing the football around and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
I never really had that growing up. But I do give my dad credit because he still supported us financially, even though he was thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
And, eventually my mom and dad did go through a divorce when I was much older. But he supported us, as I was growing up, supported the family financially, which was a huge benefit and something
Yeah.
that, I don't think a lot of men do in similar situations. And so I do have to give him credit for that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Shout out to your dad. I think it's important to acknowledge, and the reason why I asked that question is the impact when we are missing one of the parents.
Mm,
I always feel like I relate to a certain degree with people who, and not necessarily like the one parent was gone 100% of the time, but just maybe they weren't as present as we would like, right? And I always relate to that. I don't know if you remember this, but I lost my mom when I was really young to
mm,
cancer. And so I
mm,
always talk a lot about what that experience was like for me, because I know a lot of young men don't have those
mm,
relationships with their fathers, because a lot of, particularly in the Black community, a
mm,
lot of are raised with mothers primarily, and the father's not around. Well, I had the opposite. I was raised with my father. My mother, passed away.
mm,
So it's interesting to understand how that shapes our reality. Because, like you were saying, being able to maybe play football or play sports or do activities with your father, you didn't get to have that access. I
mm,
also didn't have the opportunity to see other boys with their mothers and the things that they do and the bonds and the relationships that they shared.
mm,
I always yearned for that
mm,
because I didn't have it. So I always think it's important to acknowledge the way that that might play on the way that we shape our relationships in the future, families, if we desire them in the future. And if it left any holes in us that we need to maybe do our own work in to understand how that might be impacting us even in this present moment.
mm.
That makes sense. But so slightly pivoting off of that now, because I think you give us a pretty good understanding of where your family came from. Talking more about how you started to go through school and ultimately getting into like your career and where you're at today. What got you ultimately on that path to want to pursue medicine?
So for me, I guess I'm kind of in a unique situation where I always wanted to be a doctor. When I was young, I remember being in Japan and there's like videos of me as a kid watching those commercials where you had like almost like the UNICEF commercials where they have the
Mm,
Africans starving and donate now to support a kid in
yep.
Africa. And so I remember as a kid, that was the first time that I saw people that weren't privileged or like had, support or, didn't have shoes or food to eat. And
Yeah.
it was so shocking to me that there were people out there that lived like that.
No doubt.
And so as a kid, my like, mind was like, oh, how can I help them? I'll be a doctor, even though I had no idea what being a doctor meant
Right.
at the time. And so it kind of just stuck with me. And then as I grew older and, researched more about what it takes to be a doctor, it just really stood out to me just because it's a respected profession. You do help people and change their lives.
Hmm.
You're a leader in the community. The lifestyle can be good depending on what field you go into.
Right.
And it just kind of is mentally stimulating for me. And so it required me to be at the best of my abilities. And so I just continue to pursue it. And so, for me, I'm the first physician in my family. I'm the first, college graduate in my family. And so, the path to get to where I am was a little difficult just because I didn't
Sure.
have good mentors who had done the path before me to give me advice.
Yes,
And
sir.
so I relied on other people to give me advice, and sometimes the advice wasn't the best necessarily, or and so I did a lot of my own research, or meant kind of modeled my behavior after other people that I looked up to, and kind of figured it out on my own.
Yeah.
It was definitely a grind. I did have some slip and falls along the way, but it's just if you really want it bad enough, you just kind of keep going and get it.
Oh yeah, no, no doubt, man. And I can definitely relate with the first one in college to do a lot of the things that you do. I think a
Hmm.
lot of us, unfortunately, hopefully not so much in the future, but a lot of us, particularly from Black and Brown communities, are the first to sort of trailblaze in whatever career field or industry we choose to go into.
Hmm.
And because of that, like you said, there's a lack of mentorship or what I would just say guidance. When you have, like, for example, if I was your dad and I was a doctor, there's obviously some game I can give you, right? There's
Hmm.
some guidance I can provide, not because I know exactly what you're going to deal with or
Hmm.
I know exactly what specialty you want to go into, but the
Hmm.
general stuff that you have to do to get to that point, I already understand,
Hmm.
even if some stuff has changed, right?
For
And then you can be
sure.
like, son, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, right?
Absolutely.
So what happens when you don't have that? Well, then, like you said, we're going to make mistakes. And
Hmm.
I take that example and I extrapolate that to so many other areas of our lives. What happens in any general sense when you are missing guidance?
Hmm.
That could be relationships, family building, career, friendship, like whatever it is you're trying to do. If you
Hmm.
take away that ability or opportunity to have that, it can make things inherently more difficult to deal with. But
Hmm.
kudos to you because you still did it, right? Even with regardless of the adversity and the challenges you had to experience, you still made it.
Yeah.
And I like to celebrate us that do that because it is harder. Not to
Hmm.
make it a black or white issue because I don't like to go down that road, but I do want to make the point. That is the difference in a lot of cases with us versus our counterparts, our colleagues, right? A
Hmm.
lot of times they may come from a family dynamic and a structure that they have people to go to. They have people to
Absolutely.
lean on to say, hey, this is what we do. Grandpa told me I need to go to this school.
Hmm.
Grandma said I need to study this.
Hmm.
Grandpa knows this person, dad knows this person to help get me started. Not that they paved
Yeah.
the path, but they help make it a little easier to understand where to
Absolutely.
go, right? Especially when we're young and our minds are very
Hmm.
malleable. So I hope you would agree with that. Um,
Hmm.
that's another reason why I like being able to talk to brothers like you because I want people to see that you exist and regardless of the challenge, that it is possible. That's
Hmm.
why I put myself out here to be visible as well. I want people to know what's possible and that perhaps if somebody's interested in going down this path, maybe there's some guidance that we could give to them
Hmm.
at some other point in their life. But going back to your career, so obviously you've made it through. Can you talk a little bit about the process, just for those that don't know, including myself? For, maybe touching a bit about med school and then residency and kind of what happens throughout that journey.
Yeah, so for me, I did 4 years of undergrad. I went to the University of Florida, which is in Gainesville, and I majored in integrated biology, just because my college advisor at the time said that I needed to have a science background in order
Right.
to get into medicine, which I thought made sense. But in hindsight, that's not necessarily the case. If I could do it all over again, I would have picked a major that I really felt passionate about, like something like business or finance or something like that, that I
Mm,
could add to my skills as a doctor.
interesting. Okay.
Um, you just have to do well in your science classes in order to be,
Right.
to get into med school. You don't need to just have a full on science degree. And so I
Right.
encourage everyone who's thinking about going into med school to pursue their passions and just
Mhm.
do well in those core classes because that's all what the med schools look at.
Right.
And so I went to college at the same time I was doing research. I got into research pretty late in the grand scheme of things to go into med school. I got in as a junior because during my research into how to get into med school, I was like, oh, research, conducting research is important and it will separate you as an applicant. And so I
Hmm.
scrambled to find a research position and I was able to get into the investigators by Dr. Peggy Borum, who's one of the premier research groups on UF's campus at the
Got it.
time. I applied and got in and spent about 20 hours a week during research because I had to catch up, because I hadn't done anything in the first 2 years of college.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I also worked. And so I used to sell fragrances at Belk department store in the mall.
Right.
And so I was busy. I had a full academic schedule. I was doing 20 hours of research and about 20 hours of work. So 40 hours outside of school and studying for school. So I definitely grinded it out. Like I missed out on a lot when I was in college. I didn't go to a lot of football games or anything like that, even though we had the championship, cheer
Right.
teams at the time. And so, but it was worth it. I got into med school on my first try. Went to the University of Miami for med school, and that was an interesting experience because it was my first time out the house. I moved
Mm.
away on my own. I was living in my own place, and so definitely had some fun in med school, but also
Yeah.
had to grind it out. Um, and then I got into surgery residency, which was very tough. I know we talked about that when you came down to Miami, but
Yeah.
uh, surgery residency is just another beast. It kind of changes you as a person because you work so hard for so little reimbursement and you have to do so much. You see a lot of traumatizing stuff. Like I used to do trauma surgery. And so
Mm.
people would be dying and, you have to console them and then just go to the next patient. And
Yeah.
that can definitely wear on you.
Absolutely.
And so then I went through 5 years of general surgery and then finished up with 3 years of plastic surgery at the University of Louisville. And I just finished that, graduated in July,
Shout
and
out to
now
you,
I'm here in Miami to do private practice.
man. That's quite a journey, man. For those that didn't catch all that, that's a lot of education
Yeah.
and also a lot of guidance, like you said, that you had to really take in between the mentorship and the research, and then also working so much extensively while still doing your coursework, really
Hmm.
to set yourself apart, right? Like you said, to get it on the first try. And then all of the subsequent education and work experience that you have to put in both between med school residency and then now doing plastic surgery.
Hmm.
I think it's important for again those that are interested in medicine to hear that experience because it is a journey. It sounds like obviously it takes quite a lot of energy and time and dedication. But
Hmm.
if you could touch on really quick, I know you finished that part now, but if you could touch on a little bit about like what would the benefits be once you make it through that gauntlet, if you will.
The benefits as far as to me, like what?
Yeah, like how you feel now that you're done with all that, and how like sort of the upside may appear moving forward
Yeah.
after
So
now that you're done.
it's kind of surreal just because I spent my whole life in education at this point or
Mhm.
training. And so to be finally done is awesome feeling. I mean, I'm gonna start operating next week in private practice here in Miami, and so I'll finally be making like good money,
Yeah.
which is something that I've never experienced compared to what I've been working. As a resident, we're severely underpaid
Right. Right.
for what we do. And so it's just surreal. It's great. I'm excited because I plan on expanding my practice, and we talked about this, but
Yeah.
building a brand and doing big things from a business standpoint. And
Yeah.
that's kind of like my jazz. Like I really enjoy the challenge, and I think that my experience and training has prepared me because I'm ready to grind. I've been grinding this whole time.
Right.
And so when it's now finally going to benefit me personally, I'm all for it, And so I think it's worth it. But when you're going through it, it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, sir.
Um, but I'm starting to see like, wow, it's finally worth it.
No, that's awesome, man. And I'm glad you emphasize that part, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I think a lot of times when we go down these paths, whatever we're doing, right? Medicine happens to be a pretty challenging one, if you will. But everybody goes through different experiences trying to get to wherever they want to go. And what I'm hearing, what I'm listening to when you're describing that is thinking about resiliency.
Hmm.
I have to imagine that there was probably many times throughout that experience and those experiences that you failed,
Hmm.
that you had to go through immense adversity to try
Hmm.
to pick yourself back up and go back again and try it again and keep going till you got to the next year and the next year to ultimately where you are today, right? The payoff.
Hmm. For
And
sure.
I think that's important. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the stories of most successful people, they always have some point in their life where they had a failure or they struggled. It's very rare for someone, unless they come from a very privileged background,
Correct.
to just kind of coast through life and always win. I mean, you can even talk about people like Michael Jordan, being cut from the basketball team and then
Mm-hmm.
having to, you know, pick himself back up and have faith in his skills and everything like that. I
Yeah.
think that behind every success story, you're going to find that people do fail. And when you do fail, it's kind of how you pick yourself back up. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you can't just kind of perseverate on your failure itself, but you just have to use it and learn from it.
Oh yeah.
Then you can learn from it so it doesn't happen in the future. And then you can also teach others how to avoid the mistakes that you made. And so,
Big facts.
yeah, I think that, a little bit of failure humbles you too.
Yes,
I,
sir.
I definitely was humbled whenever I had my failures in life. But uh, it's all part of life, I think, to learn and grow from them.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you phrased it the way you did. I'm big on in therapy, I'm big on, and we talk a lot about reframing, like the way you
Mm.
see something, like give it a different approach to how you
Mhm.
see something. So you talk about failure, a lot of times we get knocked down and it could feel just like that. Like against this insurmountable odd. I'm on the ground looking up. I don't know how
Mhm.
I'm going to beat this, you know?
Mhm.
Especially going back to your point about when we're going through college, if we don't have these people to guide us through these things,
Mhm.
it can feel like you're blind, just kind of going and trying stuff.
Mhm.
And when you find a way to make it through, though, understanding that that challenge will be there, that great people or successful people have had to go through similar circumstances. I hope that that gives people and inspires hope and courage within them to continue persevering. And
Mhm.
I will back up everything you just said because I've had to do my fair share as well. And so for those that want to go down any path, even if you get immediate success, even if you get quick success, right?
Mhm.
Understanding it can be taken from you.
Absolutely.
But if you can stay the course, if you can stay hungry, stay disciplined, stay motivated, I think it can play out for us in a positive way. But we have to be willing to stay on that path and not deviate as much. But I wonder sometimes, and obviously we're in a slightly different age demographic than, the guys obviously underneath us and women underneath us. I wonder sometimes if they are not quite as resilient as maybe we had to be
Mhm.
willing to push through as much. Not because you want life to always be so hard, right? We
Mhm.
don't want it to be like there's
Mm-mm.
something to be said about challenge. Challenge in itself isn't bad, but
Mhm.
there is a thing when you give somebody so much that they can get overwhelmed,
Mhm.
where you might lose somebody, right? You might lose a potentially great doctor because the circumstances of life are just too much and it just, beat him to a pulp.
Mhm.
Do you wonder, or have you noticed anything when it comes to maybe like the people who are under you, maybe years behind you, of things that they might have had more struggle with that you were able to overcome in your time?
Um, you know, um, the generations that are under us now, their lives are so different, I think, because of social media.
Yes,
And
sir.
so they have the opportunity to look at how other people around them are doing, or the false sense of, that everyone on social media, what they're posting is like these great, fantastic lives. And, here I am in my room and I'm bored and I have nothing to do. And everyone's traveling or taking these, fantastic photos of dinners and stuff like that.
Right,
And so
right.
I do think that, the younger generations have that, comparison. Like for us, we didn't really look at each other like that. Like we can kind of
No.
like, hey man, how's it going? What you up to? Like we
On the
didn't
phone
really
actually.
yeah, yeah, actually on the phone. This is actually like a phone where you used to hold,
Yeah. Not
not
just
the
scrolling.
yeah. And so I can see why people younger than us have more of a struggle being motivated because, if you're looking at everyone around you, quote unquote, succeeding or having these great lives, you
Yeah.
might feel more depressed or unmotivated that, there's something wrong with you because, you're not living the lives that you're seeing on social media.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to educate people that like social media is fake, right? I mean, you're only putting the best part of yourselves on social media because a lot of people are afraid to
Woo.
show their vulnerability,
Big facts. Big
you
facts.
know? And
Big fact.
so you kind of just have to put your head down sometimes and ignore the social media and just really focus on you. I mean, there are benefits to social media. There's so much access to resources and,
Yes, sir.
opportunities like your podcast where you can hear experts in the field just discussing stuff, for free, right? Pretty
Right,
much.
right.
And so there are benefits if you utilize the right resources. And so if you're searching out like TED Talks or you're searching out, advice from the experts, and here's a time where you don't, like we talked about, we didn't have access to help. These days, if you really seek it out, you can find help.
Yeah.
And so the opportunities are there. It's just kind of how you decide to go down which path. And so,
No, that's so important, man. I got to emphasize that part because I talk about that so much, man. Like, just I consider myself relatively new to the social media game in terms of like the big platforms,
mhm,
Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. Because Facebook, we came up with that, but that's kind of old now. Snapchat
mhm,
somewhat, but that's not necessarily on the same wave. Like big platforms where you can really reach a lot of people. I'm relatively a novice in that space, but I say that because we didn't grow up with it. So one thing
mhm,
I talk a lot about is when we talk about a sense of identity,
mhm,
we didn't have to compete necessarily with people who don't even live in our local environment,
mhm,
right? Like in those days, it was just who people maybe that you went to school with and people in your local community in
mhm,
terms of comparison.
mhm,
Now you might be on scrolling like this. There's a 17-year-old, but he's in Australia or he's in Japan or he's in Nigeria or wherever, and they're doing this, and now I feel less than. Now I
mhm,
feel inadequate because I
mhm,
can see them. Whereas you
mhm,
and I, we didn't see that. We were able to more or less put our heads down and just focus on what we're doing. So I
mhm,
do think that's important to stress that point. Just because you see something online doesn't necessarily mean it's that person's reality. And for
mhm,
me as a therapist, man, I got to echo that point you just said. Social media is not real like 100% of the time. People
mhm,
say things and they portray things to look a certain kind of way, but rarely do they tell the whole story. So when you talk about vulnerability, that's the whole purpose of this platform,
mhm,
is to be real, to talk about a lot of the stuff that we actually deal with, that we actually have to go through. And that's why very happy that you talk so much about the adversity that you've had to experience, both as a young man, just growing up in your family and in your household, and then talking about doing it through school, which is
mhm,
also very important because of the career that you chose. And a lot of us may choose careers that will require education or even graduate education. So we got to understand what we have to go through
mhm,
or what we're going to have to deal with. I do want to ask you, kind of going back to that point you mentioned about when you're going through that gauntlet when you're in residency.
mhm,
And obviously, I ask a lot about people seeing if they ever seek out mental health services for
mhm,
whatever they got going on. I'm
mhm.
wondering, do you remember at any point in time throughout that, maybe that entire experience? It could be undergrad, it could even be in high school, up until like where you're at now. At any point, did you ever feel comfortable or think that you needed to go talk to a mental health professional before?
Oh, definitely. Like the thought has crossed my mind. I definitely felt like I experienced like a depressive episode when I was in residency, especially during my intern year, because I was in Boston. I was hundreds of miles away from Florida, dealing with
Mm,
snow. I grew up in Florida, and so it was freezing cold up in Boston. I didn't really know anybody, and and then I'm
Yeah.
working at the county hospital where they're just working us like dogs. I remember like working 3 weeks of days and then 1 week of nights, and they would say that that 24-hour period where we transition from days to nights and nights to days was a day off. And so I literally would sleep,
Wow.
the whole the whole almost 24 hours and just wake up and it's time for work, and now I'm on nights. But I would be so tired that I would transition so fast because I would sleep the whole time.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, it definitely felt like I had some depressive episodes, and I would probably have benefited from speaking to a mental health expert. But the problem is, during residency, you're so busy, you just don't have the time. Like, when am I
Yeah.
going to take the time to go seek a therapist? And not
Yeah.
only that, they charge or they pay us so little in residency that to make the fine, to save up some money to go see a therapist was just not really realistic to me at the
Sure.
time.
Sure.
And so, I know nowadays there are more resources like with telemedicine, you can speak to therapists remotely. And,
Hmm.
maybe that's something that I would have, taken advantage of at the time. But when I was going through residency and internship, I just, that didn't really exist. And
Yeah.
so, it's definitely tough. And I think that a lot of residents would benefit from speaking to therapy or having like a consistent therapist in their life.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of residents feel the same way that I do, that we just don't have the time.
No, and I appreciate you saying that. Obviously, that's not my area of expertise, going through that experience and that process. But I think it's important to highlight what you're saying there, because I think it's important. Like, if you are the program or institution that's having residents come in, at some point there has to become a prioritization of
Hmm.
one's mental health.
Hmm.
I think about that because, for example, I mean, me being professional, it's hard for me to not constantly think to a certain degree, how are the people around me doing? So if I was
Hmm.
to go see you and you seem like disheveled and you seem like, so maybe you were dissociating because you have so much stuff going on, you've been sleeping so little, you've been getting run into the ground, I'd be concerned for my well-being for you to practice on me,
Hmm.
because who's making sure that you are being afforded the time to take care of yourself?
Hmm.
You know, I think that that's really, really important.
Hmm.
So that's a big reason why I promote in this platform and talk a lot about these experiences, and I appreciate you for emphasizing that. So if
Hmm.
you are going through those experiences, I hope sincerely that those programs make it a point or make it a priority to allow for those individuals to have some time to
Hmm.
invest in themselves, because I also think a lot about the conditions that we go through. So it can start when we're young, but it certainly continues the older that we get. It shapes your perception, it shapes your reality. So if
Hmm.
I'm used to go, 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 don't take care of me, and I'll just make it through, you think that ever really changes at any point when I've been conditioned classically to go through this
Yeah.
time after time?
Hmm.
That can have disastrous effects in our relationships or just in personal self well-being
Hmm.
as I age, even when I'm not in that situation anymore, right? Even if
Yeah.
I'm making good money, I don't work at the county hospital anymore. It's like,
Hmm.
oh no, I just for example, I just learned to suppress all that, because I didn't have time. Bro, they
Hmm.
had me doing 16-hour days. I didn't
Hmm.
have time to go back and be like, am I good? No. So
Hmm.
even though I'm not in that position now, I'm still maybe asking myself sometimes, well, now the circumstances are different, but I still have all this baggage over here that I maybe never dealt with. Or maybe
Hmm.
there's new things being added to it and I never really dealt with.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping that even for those that may struggle to find the opportunity to connect with a professional, like you said, with telehealth and telemedicine, I think that there has been a bit more of access and opportunity for those that are seeking out to get it. And I hope
Hmm.
by listening to like what you said might encourage them to go do just that, because
Hmm.
I want our physicians to be well. I
Hmm.
want anybody who, does anything important, um, for the general population. I want them to be as balanced as they can be. Now that
Hmm.
might look different because you're a physician and your schedule is different, and so on and so forth. Totally fine, but just making it a priority. I'm always going to tell us we need to prioritize some level of self care, or we
Hmm.
are effectively doomed to be burnt out in whatever our profession is. I don't know if there's
Mhm.
anything you want to comment on that.
No, I think that the conversation has changed. I think that back in the day there was almost a little stigma associated with seeking mental health or
Yeah.
mental therapy and stuff. Um, but I think lately there's been so much of a shift and realization that there are people out there that are toxic, or that relationships, there's like issues in relationships. It's like, why do I keep finding these toxic people or something in my lives? And a lot of people are doing more introspection.
Yes,
And then
sir.
there's just a lot more resources online where people are talking about their experiences, and others are identifying that, hey, like that's similar to mine, and that the benefits that they got from going to therapy.
Yeah.
I do think that the conversation has shifted, and I do think that people are seeking more therapy out, and it's definitely important for people in the medical field to do that. Like we talked about, like some of the experiences that I went through, just even in
Hmm.
residency, just seeing all the traumas and just being up all the time, and it is tough, like physically tough and mentally tough to
Right.
deal with, and we are conditioned to kind of brush that off and just keep going
Yeah.
in order to help other people. But we do, I would say almost all physicians tend to neglect themselves in order to continue doing our job. And
Yeah.
so, now that I have kind of gotten past that, and a different stage in my life, I do plan on seeking, just to check in and make sure
Sure.
that, if there's any issues. I think it's healthy to have a therapist. I mean, even people like Jay-Z talks about going to therapy and the benefits that he had going to
Yeah.
therapy and dealing with, his experiences growing up. I do think that it's important, if you have the opportunity to seek it out.
Yes. Amen. Absolutely agree. Can't back that up enough. I think even I would usually make the example, just like especially with you being a doctor, the same way we would say get a physical check in or checkup.
Mm,
You're not necessarily going in because everything is falling apart. You're just like, I just want to make sure Dr. Keys gave me that clear. I'm good to go. It
mhm,
might be something similar. And you
mhm,
don't always have to come when something's wrong. I like to mention that a lot of times people come when they're in crisis, which is
mhm.
okay, but you don't have to wait until you're in crisis to come. I do want to ask you, lastly, just if you want to touch on anything about what you're planning for your future in terms of your career and any other goals that you have.
Yeah, so I'm a plastic surgeon, and so right now I'm working in private practice doing 100% aesthetics here in Miami, Florida. But my long-term plan is to build my brand, which is called Celebrity Plastics. You can find it on Instagram, where I talk about celebrity before and afters, as well as showcase some of the world's best plastic surgery from different providers who kind of advertise through my platform.
Yeah.
Eventually, I want to turn that celebrity plastics into a brick and mortar practice for myself, and then expand that nationally and hire other plastic surgeons, and give that quality, luxurious experience. And that is my ultimate long term plan. And so I know you're an entrepreneur too. And so I do like to see you succeed, man.
Appreciate you, brother.
Seeing that how much you've grown since we were both in high school. It's amazing to get back in touch. And, I really applaud that you're doing this for other people. And I wish you all the best, man.
Thank you, man. I appreciate you a lot for saying that. And of course, we congratulate and praise you for going through everything that you've gone through to get to this point, man. I hope if there's any opportunity to collab and to encourage everything that you got going on, we totally throw our support behind that. I want us to support each other more, particularly men, because I know we don't always feel that. And
Mm-hmm.
that's another point of the platform is I want us to give each other our flowers while we're here and to encourage and praise each other when we're doing big things because it's hard. The
Mm-hmm.
work we're doing is not simple. And again, a lot of us, we don't have the guidance. Maybe it
Mm-hmm.
would have been easier, but we're living our life in real time. We're making decisions in real time. So again, I appreciate you so much for making the time to be here. And I really hope if there's any prospective, doctors out there or even prospective plastic surgeons out there that they got some value from listening to you speak and understanding a bit about what the experience may be like, for
Mm,
those that want to go down that road. And I just want to conclude by saying that this is one of those situations where I don't always get to have professionals like yourself on here. And so I hope that somebody resonates with that. Seeing
mm,
you, number one, feel like a young black or brown boy, that this man is possible, that it is
mm,
possible for you to go down a similar road if you want, regardless of the adversity that you may have to go through, as Michael touched on. And it's important to understand that there may be some bumps in the road and times you get knocked down, and you might fail a few times, but don't think that that has to define you, as long as you're willing to continue to get back up and try again, and
mm.
maybe approach it from a different angle, and make sure, of course, that you're okay, hopefully, throughout that journey. But I appreciate you again, brother, for being here. This was a lovely episode. I hope that if anybody got value from listening to this or watching this, that you would like or subscribe to the channel, because it helps to promote these types of discussions. And until next time, man, we're gonna call that one a peace out.
All right, brother. Good talking to you, man. I'll be happy to come back anytime.